Bear with me, everybody. Welcome. Wow, Vanya did a great job of describing my role. That's what I was going to introduce myself with. So instead of describing who I am, since you've probably already heard that, I will just give a shout out to Sarah Nizzi, who is my counterpart. So I work in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and you all are fortunate to have Sarah Nizzi. I hope you already know her. She is based in Iowa. She does pretty much the same kind of work I do, and you should go say hello to her at the PFI conference next week. So I guess thank you all again for being here. I will advance my slides. Hopefully this works. You can see the next slide, I think.
Yep, looks good.
So the obligatory kind of introduction to the Xerces Society. For those of you who aren't as familiar with our organization, we are a science-based nonprofit wildlife conservation organization that works to protect invertebrates and their habitat. We take our name from this Xerces blue butterfly pictured here. It's the first butterfly to go extinct in North America due to human-influenced habitat loss. So over 50 years ago, we started as a butterfly conservation organization, and since then we've really broadened our scope and our mission to protect birds of all kinds. And let's see, we have, it seems like there's a slight lag in my advancing. So we do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work. We have probably our largest program is our Pollinator and Agricultural Biodiversity Program. That's the program that houses me and Sarah Nizzi, among other biologists, conservation specialists like me. We also have a pretty large endangered species program that's doing a lot of amazing work with monarchs and bumblebees and freshwater mussels, among other invertebrates. We have a really strong pesticide and policy team. A lot of urban programming and community engagement, lots of ways to kind of get involved with our work or follow along. It's also, I need to mention that we are also a member-based organization. So if you like what you're hearing today, if you're interested in some of these topics, I encourage you to become a member. I also encourage you to become a member of PFI because we need strong partners in this network. This is, collective conservation work. So membership across a lot of organizations in the network is really important. So you'll see a lot of pollinator talks kind of start this way. This is not going to be an exception. It seems like every week and month there are new papers coming out talking about the decline in insect diversity and abundance, and not only that the insects are declining, but also the impact that those declines are having on their ecosystems and their food webs. But I do want to draw your attention to this one paper that's in the front there, Declines in Insect Abundance and Diversity. We know enough to act now. I just love that title. This is published by a couple of my coworkers and a collaborative researcher, Matt Forrester. And if there's nothing else that you walk away with, I think that's a really good take-home message right up front. We know enough to act on solutions now. But I wish I could just leave it there, but instead I do want to give a few more details about these insect declines, because I think it'll give us some perspective that might help understand the rest of the presentation. A lot of you have probably heard about rusty patch bumblebees in decline. These are the first bumblebee to be listed as federally endangered. We still have some in the upper Midwest, some strongholds in Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, kind of Chicago area, but they are still critically threatened with extinction. And there are others that are threatened with extinction as well. About a quarter of our bumblebee species in North America are severely threatened and vulnerable. These are really keystone species in a lot of ecosystems. A lot of you have probably heard about monarch butterfly declines, but you may not be aware of other butterflies that are native to the upper Midwest, are once common species, but are actually also in decline. There was a paper that came out with some results from a 21-year survey, and this is kind of an unusual type of data set for North America. 21-year survey of weekly weekly surveys of butterflies in Ohio. And after 20 years, they found, basically a cumulative about 30% decline in abundance of about 81 different butterfly species. That is, I should say, 81 different butterfly species. A few of them were stable. A few of them actually increased their populations, but 3 times as many species had negative population trends compared to positive trends. So that's pretty alarming. These are insects that are disappearing from our environment that are the base of food chains. It's not just pollinators that are struggling. We're seeing huge biomass declines in mayflies. 1/3 of our tiger beetle species in North America are sufficiently rare to be considered threatened or endangered. I mean, these are just like really critical animals for a lot of our ecosystems, terrestrial and aquatic, and there's a lot at stake in their declines. What I'm showing you here is that insects are by far the most diverse group of animals on this planet. They make up the vast majority of species diversity within the animal kingdom. That's well over 1 million described species. There are many that are undescribed yet. And that incredible species diversity has led to really important and highly specialized niches in their ecosystems. And the role that they play in these ecosystems often creates stability and resiliency in those systems. And finally, I think it's worth pointing out that, these are all different species that, we have a lot to learn from. And although they're not the most charismatic animals, they all have kind of a hunger for life, just like you and me. So here's like a little glimpse of who some of these, insects are. So when we plant pollinator habitat, not only are we inviting a variety of pollinators to that habitat, we're also bringing along with it all these other animals out there that are doing really wild things. They're, of course, pollinating plants, but they're also feeding on seeds. They're dispersing seeds all around. They're responsible for a lot of decomposition and nutrient cycling, feeding on dead animals, feeding on dead plant material. They're preying upon each other and parasitizing each other. It's kind of ruthless, but it is actually, and they're also creating food for the rest of the food chain, that tree swallow up there. This is like just really, really critical kind of biodiversity out there. And I just wanted you to get kind of like a snapshot of who these guys are. So clearly habitat is the key ingredient to bring about all this life. Studies show that when we incorporate habitat into cropland or farmland, we really bring with it all these beneficial insects, the abundance and the diversity of those insects. And so just to step back and just make sure that we're talking about the same thing, defining our terms. When I talk about high quality habitat, what I'm talking about are 3 key kind of elements. The first is food. So that's easy when you think about a pollinator that might need nectar and pollen, but also thinking about all those other insects, they need specific plant materials. Sometimes they have really specialized relationships with certain types of plants. They need prey species. So some of those predatory beneficial insects that we want in the environment need some prey species like aphids. They need shelter. So a lot of our native shelter in overwintering habitat. A lot of our native bees are ground nesting bees. And 70% of them are ground nesting bees. And I have this picture here of a little bee poking its head out of its nest. But it's important to say here that when they're nesting in the ground, they're also potentially getting exposed to pesticides that are in the soil as well. Like they're handling soil with their mouth parts, they're making little bedrooms in the soil for their offspring. And when the soil has pesticide residues, it maybe goes without saying that that environment becomes kind of risky for them. So you can see how some of these elements may be kind of interacting. So the highest quality habitat has high quality food, shelter that's undisturbed, and refuge from pesticides. So that kind of tees up Emily to talk about some of those pesticide risks in pollinator habitat. And I'm going to advance Emily's slide. So you just let me know when you're ready, Emily.
Will do. Thanks, Karin. Thanks for teeing us off. So thanks everyone for joining us here today. I'm Emily May. I'm a pollinator conservation specialist with the pesticide program at Xerces. I'm the team lead on agricultural pesticide risks to invertebrates, including pollinators. And what I do is help provide support to our field staff across the country that are working to plan and create high quality habitat in agricultural landscapes. So my background is in wild bees and pest management in fruit crops, particularly blueberries, where bees are providing essential pollination services. But since starting at Xerces, I've broadened out into trying to understand management systems and lots of other different crops that we are working in or adjacent to. So our goal as a conservation organization is to make sure that we are maximizing the benefits of the pollinator habitat that we're putting our dollars into or working on with others. More flowering resources on the landscape is generally a good thing. But we also recognize that the value of habitat can be compromised by contamination with pesticides. So my part of the talk here, the purpose is to get you thinking about some of the potential risks to pollinators from pesticide drift and contamination, including in row crops, so that we can try to better create cleaner habitat, maximize its benefits for pollinators and other wildlife that are using that habitat. So I'll start by talking about some basics of pesticides, review some recent field research, and talk about resources for mitigating that risk. So it's kind of broadly relevant to all kinds of pollinator habitat that is near crop fields. Okay, Karin, go ahead and advance this. So in general, we know, as Karin sort of set us up, we know that a lack of flowering resources, high quality food and shelter is often what is limiting the number of pollinators in agricultural landscapes. And we know that providing them with that food and shelter can boost populations. That's how we get more pollinators. But we also know that there is increasing risk from drift and runoff and subsurface movement of pesticides the closer that habitat is to treated fields. So some of you might have control of what's happening in the fields that your habitat is near, and some of you might not. It might be thinking about what's going on in neighboring land. We know from a lot of research that field margins are often contaminated with, field margins of treated fields, contaminated with insecticides and fungicides. Habitat that's next to treated fields can also be degraded by herbicide use. You might have, fewer flowers, or you might have delayed flowering or other impacts on the plants that get exposed to herbicide drift. Given all of these types of contamination risks, we have had some concerns and been thinking about what it means to add native flowering prairie species and bunch grasses to catchment habitat. So these, the kind of vegetative buffer strips that are specifically designed for capturing sediment and nutrient runoff from farm fields. Those places are more likely to be contaminated with the types of pesticides that move with water or with sediment into catchment areas. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So you can go ahead and move on, Karin, but I'm going to go through a little bit of background info on pesticide risks to pollinators. So I'm going to start a little bit in the weeds, and I'll apologize for starting there, but I think it's useful for understanding a little bit more about the toxicity of pesticides to pollinators. Toxicity is really another way of saying how harmful is this pesticide? How likely is it to kill or to otherwise harm an insect? This is important for how pesticides get categorized by the US Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, as highly toxic or practically non-toxic to bees. So before a pesticide is registered, pesticide manufacturers have to submit the results of a variety of different tests that are looking at toxicity to birds and mammals and fish and insects, depending on how that pesticide is expected to be used. And the way that EPA assesses toxicity to bees is based on pretty simple laboratory testing of adult honeybees. And I've kind of done a little photoshopping here to show you what that test looks like. They basically apply pesticide at different doses to the top of the thorax of adult honeybees, similar to that picture, and look for the amount that kills half of the tested group of adult honeybees over 48 hours. So the smaller the dose that kills half of the test population, the more toxic that pesticide is to bees. And that dose is called, it's a sort of a standardized measure called the LD50, the lethal dose that kills 50% of the group of bees that were tested. And then the EPA sort of assigns pesticides into different groupings of toxicity based on that number. So honeybees are kind of the stand-in for all other bees in this standardized testing. And not just that, all other terrestrial insects, including monarchs, including many other things that aren't bees in these tests. So our great diversity of native bees aren't always well represented by adult honeybees in these toxicity tests. They might be more or less sensitive than honeybees to different kinds of pesticides. So the way that EPA groups toxicity is kind of a crude tool for classification. Toxicity falls on a pretty wide spectrum. And some pesticides have harm that isn't well captured by this particular test, but this is what we have. So Karin, you can go to the next slide. So I wanted to talk more broadly about toxicity or harm and how are pesticides toxic to insects, right? So insecticides are that group of pesticides that are designed to kill insects. There are lots of different ways that a chemical could affect an insect and cause harm. And a pesticide's mode of action is the specific way or the mechanism by which that pesticide causes harm. Generally speaking, the most common types of modes of action for insecticides are targeting the nervous system of the insect. So these nervous system actors are lots of different ways to achieve the same effect, which is overstimulating the nervous system, leading to knockdown and death. So some of the types of insecticides that fall into this nervous system category are some of the really big common ones like organophosphates, pyrethroids, neonicotinoids, which you might have heard about. All of those kind of fall into that same nervous system actor category. And then there are other types of modes of action like insect growth regulators. This is a group of insecticides that acts on growth and development. So they're primarily toxic to developing insects that haven't reached maturity yet. Some of them are mimicking a hormone that causes insects to molt prematurely, and others might affect an insect's ability to make chitin, which is what makes up the exoskeleton of insects. So when that insect molts or sheds its shell during the course of development, it can't reform its exoskeleton and it dies kind of an ugly death. So the images on the right are those molting abnormalities that are caused by exposure to insect growth regulators. That's a milkweed bug on the top and a cabbage white butterfly on the bottom. So this is where that assessing the risk of pesticides can get a little complicated. So standardized testing, like I showed you on the last slide, is performed on adult honeybees for pesticide registration, but a fully mature adult honeybee isn't likely to be affected by an insect growth regulator that affects growth and development. So an IGR might have impacts on developing larvae that are eating pollen and nectar brought back to the nest, or it might affect caterpillars feeding on contaminated host plants. But insect growth regulators are often classified as reduced risk to bees because they have low toxicity to adult honeybees as captured in that test. So we're always trying to get a better understanding on a better handle of some of the kinds of gaps that exist in our regulatory system. And we're trying to protect all kinds of pollinators in the real world, just to give you a little insight into that. So you can go to the next slide. So, and I'm sorry to show all of these complicated things right up front, but just getting it out of the way. So this is a little bit more context for some trends in insecticide use over the last 2 decades, what those mean for toxicity. One thing that you've probably heard is that pesticide risk has declined over the last 2 or 3 decades as the amount of insecticides applied to crops has also declined. There's an overall decline in the total pounds of pesticide that are being applied per acre, which is largely due to replacement of older chemicals, organophosphates, which are very heavy. They're applied in pounds per acre, with newer chemicals that are applied in ounces per acre, like pyrethroids and neonicotinoid insecticides. And so in general, those changes have meant less pesticide risk to people and to other mammals, but they've actually led to, and this is what this figure is showing, significantly higher total toxicity to bees, even with fewer pounds applied per acre, because some of those newer chemicals are that much more toxic to bees, even when they're applied at ounces per acre. So this is from a study that shows the total toxicity load to honeybees in the US from insecticides used from the 90s, early 90s to 2014. And the toxic load is calculated from the sort of an index of total mass of insecticides, their toxicity to honeybees, and then their persistence in the environment. And the active ingredients listed there on the side are some of the most common from each class of insecticides. So as use of organophosphates, those older chemicals in green declined. So that's chlorpyrifos, which has now been banned for agricultural use. The use of neonics in blue has grown exponentially, including use as seed coatings, foliar sprays, as well as soil drenches. So these are now the most widely used insecticides in the US. And this chart includes use as seed treatments, just to be clear. So they're also highly toxic to bees, and they represent most of the jump in toxic load for pollinators in this chart. So there is a lot to unpack here, but the main takeaway that I'm hoping you think about is how our agricultural management is likely to affect the insects that we like, along with some of the ones that we don't like that are, agricultural pests. And so knowing that many of the pesticides in common use are highly toxic to bees, what can we be doing to create safer spaces for pollinators around those fields? So you can go to the next slide. So just taking a step back here for a quick definition. I've been using the word risk a lot, and I think it's helpful to know that it has a specific meaning, which is basically made up of 2 things. So there are 2 factors in the risk of a pesticide to any organism, whether that's a person or whether that's a bee. One side of that is toxicity, or that capacity of a pesticide to cause harm that we've talked about. How toxic is it? In what way does it harm the insect? And then the second part is exposure. How much of the pesticide is the pollinator exposed to? Was it exposed on the outside of its body? Did it take it in pollen and nectar or in the leaves of its host plant? For how long? And then, was it a one-time pesticide application, or was the pollinator continuously exposed to it in its food? All of this basically boils down to risk is about the dose making the poison. So a highly toxic pesticide that a pollinator is only a little bit exposed to might actually be less risky than a less toxic pesticide that a pollinator is exposed to all the time. It helps us think about how we might reduce risk. It could mean if we have control, choosing a less toxic pesticide, a different pesticide to use in managing a specific pest. Or it might mean figuring out ways to protect that habitat from exposure so that it doesn't become contaminated. You can go to the next slide. So we talked about toxicity. The other side of risk is exposure. How are pollinators actually exposed? There are lots of different ways that pollinators could potentially become exposed to a pesticide, including direct contact with a spray, indirect contact when a pollinator visits a plant that was previously treated or had drift on it, contaminated nesting materials or nesting sites, like Karin mentioned. 70% of our native bees are in soil for much of their lives. So they might come into contact with it as they're excavating out those rooms in the soil. And then also systemic contact. So many pesticides that are water soluble may move into plants where they could be picked up by caterpillars, butterfly larvae munching on those plants, or by bees that are feeding on pollen and nectar of those plants. So the type of pollinator and its behavior, whether it nests in the soil, what plants it consumes, are key to understanding those possible routes of exposure. Next slide. This is just another way to visualize that same thing. I thought it was helpful for thinking about how pesticides move in the environment. So pollinators could be exposed directly when pesticides are applied to a field, including from drift or dust off from the application of treated seeds. They could also be exposed to contaminated plants, soil, or water that received overspray or drift, runoff, or leaching. And then systemic pesticides like the neonicotinoids or diamide insecticides can be very mobile and make their way into plants in field margins or strips. So generally speaking, the closer a habitat is to where pesticides are applied, the more likely it is to receive that kind of drift or leaching. Okay, back to prettier pictures. So how do we think about this for the types of pollinators that we're looking to conserve in our habitat? We want to be thinking about what species might be affected, let's say, by a soybean aphid treatment in the field where we're planting habitat. So the types of species that are most likely to be affected are those that are living in the habitat, locally resident. So as opposed to something like a monarch butterfly is highly mobile, and they tend to, we call it bet hedging. They hedge their bets by laying eggs on lots of different patches across the landscape, which means that monarchs at a population level are actually somewhat more buffered from disturbance of small patches than species that are locally resident. So if a monarch female is laying eggs in one patch that gets wiped out, hopefully she would have eggs and larvae that survive to adulthood on a different patch because they're moving all across the landscape and laying eggs all over the place. And it is that feature of monarchs that is why modeling studies from Iowa State have found that the best approach for monarchs is planting milkweeds anywhere space is available so that they have the maximum number of possible patches to hedge bets on. But that's probably not the case for other insects that are less mobile. So resident butterfly species that don't move very far may have only laid eggs in a single patch of their host plant. Same with native bees. Bees are what we call central place foragers. So they make a nest and then they forage around that nest. So if the nest itself gets disturbed, whether that's from tillage or fire or pesticides, then that's the end of that nest. So at a population level, these kinds of local residents are more vulnerable to local extirpation from a spray than monarchs might be. So something to keep in mind when we're thinking about what types of species we're creating habitat for. If we're designing habitat for monarchs specifically, we might have more flexibility than if we're creating habitat for other species of concern. So one of the things that I've been doing for the last few years is reviewing decades of research on pesticide drift and contamination in field margins to try and better understand how we can protect habitat. So some of the key takeaways, first, unfortunately, there's pretty widespread contamination of plants near agricultural fields that receive pesticides. And some of the concentrations of those pesticides reported in field studies exceed acute levels of concern for bees. So exceed levels that are likely to kill at least some percentage of the population, particularly in places where foliar applications are occurring alongside seed treatments. So a couple of studies from Midwestern row crops in more detail. Soybean aphid, as some of you probably know, is an important mid-season pest of soy. About a third of Iowa's soybean acreage is treated for this pest every year with pretty broad spectrum insecticides. So in the corn soy rotation, there are going to be years in fields where that crop might only have insecticide inputs in the form of seed treatments. And then there are going to be years in fields that receive foliar insecticide applications, often aerially. So there was a study from last year from Minnesota that measured spray drift from soybean insecticide applications into adjacent tallgrass prairie habitat. And they found insecticides all the way out to 200 meters from the field edge, including in one grassland site that was downwind of an aerial application that contained residues at the full field rate, 82 feet into the grassland. So that was chlorpyrifos, which is an organophosphate, and that was well in excess of the honeybee acute contact LD50. If you remember, that's the amount that killed 50% of the test population of honeybees in the lab. So that's a really pretty concerning rate from that insecticide application occurring in the field 82 feet upwind. The study also found lower drift from ground boom applications of the same insecticides, but residues were still pretty high at the field edge, meaning if bees were present at that field edge, they risked that sort of level of harm that was equal to or in excess of the amount that killed half of bees in that lab test. So the takeaway that I have from reading all of these types of studies and spending a lot of time with models of drift deposition is that I wouldn't want my pollinator habitat downwind of aerial insecticide applications or immediately adjacent to boom applications of really highly toxic insecticides like pyrethroids. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, but this is where having even like a small amount of untreated area, a buffer zone between the crop and your habitat, can be really useful to make sure that the highest rate of drift from field applications is occurring in the buffer and not in the pollinator habitat. The other key findings from that review are really that soils are taking the brunt of contamination, especially down slope of seed treatments. You could expect that 90 or 100% of those field margin soils are going to have some level of neonicotinoids, whatever the seed, systemic seed treatment is. And those detections can last pretty long after those seeds were last used. You can move to the next slide. I wanted to talk just briefly a little bit more about prairie strips specifically, because this is a practice that is growing in use around the Midwest. These are buffer strips that are planted with flowering prairie vegetation. And there have been a few studies looking at concentrations of pesticides in the actual vegetation through the summer. So there was a recent study that measured neonics specifically from fields where those fields had received seed treatments, but no foliar insecticides. So what they found was sort of universal low levels of neonics in the prairie strip vegetation. 80% of the forbs, including the milkweeds, in those strips had detectable neonics, compared with a range of about, looking at the other papers that I had looked at, about 5 to 60% of plants in field margins with comparable analytical methods. So if I had to guess, I would say strips are going to be more universally contaminated because of seed treatments, because of also the way that habitat is designed to catch sediment and nutrient runoff. And so they're going to catch those pesticides that move with water, like the systemics used as seed treatments. But they did have, these strips in this study had lower levels of pesticides on average than studies that are sampling in the margins of fields that received those foliar sprays. So things like boom applications or aerial applications. That makes sense if the contamination is coming from seed treatments rather than foliar sprays, just in terms of the rates applied. But that's still a lot of potential contamination. Some of those concentrations exceeded levels found to reduce bumblebee and solitary bee reproduction and immune response through chronic exposure. And this was conducted in fields that had no foliar applications. So about 30% of soybean acreage in Iowa receives broad spectrum insecticides annually for soybean aphid. So that was one study. Another one measuring neonic residues in strips that hadn't received treated seed or foliar applications in the last 2 years found no residues in those plants. So there are places where strips might be much less contaminated, especially with growers that are seeking out untreated seeds or in fields that have less pest pressure that aren't receiving those foliar applications. So something to keep in mind for this type of catchment habitat. Some places might be better suited for it than others. Thanks, Karin. So the good news is that we do know from dozens of studies of flower enhancements of all kinds, even those that are going into areas that are likely to be contaminated, that flowering habitat generally has net benefits for pollinators and could even potentially partially buffer the effects of pesticides on bees. So giving bees a good diet, a good nutrition, supports their immune response to pesticides when they encounter them. So there is support for putting habitat in, even in places that are likely to have some level of contamination. We can still feel good about some of the habitat that we're creating. But in general, more protected habitat is likely to be higher quality for insect populations. Protected habitat that provides that refuge for pollinators. There are also numerous studies that have found that agricultural lands that have lower pesticide inputs have higher abundance and richness of bees and other beneficials. So some of my big takeaway, I would say, is if we're using our dollars to create habitat, let's try to prioritize creating that habitat where we can in areas that are more protected, or at least better understand the potential risks of drift and contamination and how to mitigate those. Take the next slide. So I wanted to walk through some of the main things that we think about. We have a lot of farm planners that are going out and assessing where to put habitat, what's the best spot. Here we're trying to figure out some of the, both sides of the risk equation for exposure and toxicity of pesticides, as well as how we can best support sort of the resource concern for pollinators. What plants do we need to put in there? What's kind of habitat is going to be the best for this space? So in terms of assessing pesticide risk, as one small part of all the other things we're considering, is timing of pesticide applications. So in crops that flower, bees and other pollen and nectar seeking insects are most likely to be in fields when that crop is in bloom, true for soybeans too. And pesticide applications during or near bloom are the most likely to directly expose those insects. For pesticide applications, we are also thinking about where they are relative to habitat. So sometimes we're working with growers to put habitat in orchard understories, but we're pretty cautious about vetting the program in those orchards as understory plants are going to be exposed to whatever is being applied in the orchard. So thinking about lots of different things here, the type of pesticide, the toxicity and what it's toxic to. Is it toxic by oral or by contact? And then, are there key pests that get treated every year? Are there occasional pests that trigger applications in some years, but not others? Is the grower using IPM, sort of scouting and monitoring and thresholds to trigger applications and implementing prevention to help reduce the needs for inputs? Could they consider other methods for those pests? And then finally, we're thinking about equipment, application method, how likely pesticides are moving offsite into habitat. Aerial spraying is quite prone to drift, of course, but other methods like air blast sprayers can also generate a sizable amount of drift. All these factors contribute to the risk of pest management to pollinators and other beneficials, but these are some of the things that we're thinking about going out to a site and assessing potential sources of drift for pollinators. So I think I'm going to move into the resources in the last part of my talk here and then turn it back over to Karin. But this is a resource for looking up toxicity of different pesticides to bees. This is the University of California IPM Center's Bee Precaution Pesticide Ratings tool. And let's see, I think I can post this in the chat in case you're interested. So this is based mainly on the effects of pesticides on adult honeybees from those lab tests, but it does have info on interactions with other pesticides, especially fungicides, as well as some info on toxicity to honeybee brood and other bee species. So this can be a useful one for looking up specific pesticides and their toxicity to bees. I'll mention some other resources later on. So we'll keep going here. So I just, in the last part here, wanted to talk about the actual mitigation part of this. So there are several key approaches to preventing contamination of habitat if you're creating habitat for pollinators. The first one being buffers, like I mentioned, untreated spatial buffers, siting habitat away from treated fields where possible. The size of that buffer is kind of hard to predict. So drift is going to be really affected by the characteristics of the chemicals applied, timing of their application, what the wind speed and direction was like at the time of applications. But some of our guidance that I'll link in the next slide has recommendations for buffers based on the type of application equipment. You can stay on that slide and I'll get back to this in a sec, Karin. But there's a larger buffer for some of the highly mobile insecticides, like the neonicotinoids. Those numbers that are in the guidance document aren't really hard and fast, but having some level of spatial buffer is going to really help reduce the amount of drift entering habitat. Most drift is really occurring in the first 25 to 50 feet of closest to the applied field. But spatial buffers can be difficult on farms that have limited space available, or if you're really, you're butting up against neighboring fields that are being treated. So there are options for reducing drift, even if you're sort of butting right up against agricultural fields. Some of those are, the biggest one that we're implementing is typically vegetative barriers. So consisting of non-flowering woody plants and deep-rooted native grasses. So capturing both the above ground pesticide movement as well as below ground movement to reduce contamination of pollinator plantings near treated field. And that's what this graphic is showing, is really having this buffer zone that's planted with non-flowering woody plants or native grasses with deep roots that are trying to capture that above ground drift or dust off as well as below ground flow. And then in some cases, there's sort of a temporal buffer based on when pesticide applications typically occur. So you might be able to design pollinator habitat so that it flowers maybe well after your typical pesticide applications are occurring, or well before your typical pesticide applications are occurring. So in designing pollinator habitat, you might be able to come up with some kind of temporal buffer between when your plants are flowering or your host plants are growing and producing butterfly larvae and when things are happening in the field next door. All right, you can move on to the next slide. So this is a general resource for everything that I've just been talking about. It covers priority pesticide concerns, how to better site habitat, some other mitigation measures. Again, it's sort of for everyone, whether or not you're in control of what's happening in the field closest to your pollinator habitat. And let's see if there's, I will put that in the chat when I'm done talking. Okay, moving on to the next one. The last resource I wanted to talk about here before turning it back over to Karin, and I'm sorry for taking so much time, Karin, is this Agronomy Tech Note 9 from the USDA, which is a very detailed guide to help NRCS state technical staff address pesticide risks to honeybees and native bees. And this, the main reason that I wanted to include this in here, you can go to the next slide, is that it has these great detailed text tables, including all of these exposure pathways, detailed descriptions of how bees get exposed, including all the ways that we talked about today. Next slide. It has also a table of specific mitigations for specific types of habitat that you're working with, like field borders, filter strips, hedgerows, and windbreaks. So it sort of links the type of planting to the type of mitigation that might be best. And then finally, next slide. It has a table with risk mitigation practices and equipment to reduce offsite movement. So these things are kind of back to the basics for many spray applicators, like careful calibration of sprayers, nozzle selection to reduce drift, ensure that most things are staying on target. And then it's also drift reduction technology like electrostatic sprayers and hooded sprayers. So electrostatic sprayers have typical forces acting on the droplets, things like gravity and inertia. Electrostatic sprayers use an air current to spray liquid into a diffuser that subjects droplets to this electric field, imbuing them with a negative charge that anyway, basically it means that more of the pesticide is attracted to the plant itself, and you can reduce the amount of pesticide applied while keeping more of it on the actual plant and improving coverage of the plant. So some of the technologies available can help reduce the amount of pesticide that's going off target. all of this to say, and I'll wrap up here, we see the value in helping the applicators take these smaller steps to mitigate risk, including these kind of end of the pipe solutions like electrostatic sprayer technology. They have their place for sure in drift reduction, but we're also taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, also trying to kind of reduce this reliance on chemical interventions for pest management wherever possible, to have longer term impacts on pollinators and other wildlife that are around those agricultural fields. So with all of that, I know that was a lot. I'll turn it over to Karin to talk about the practical solutions for high quality habitat and some examples of habitat in the fields.
Okay, thank you. Isn't she amazing? Yeah, wow. Okay, so we're going to talk about some opportunities for habitat, what that looks like on farms, and go over some case studies of how are actually doing this in the real world. A former state biologist, NRCS state biologist in Minnesota, used to say, all land is wildlife habitat, only the quality differs. And so I just like to think about that where, habitat can be around the farmstead, it can be in the crop fields, it can be, in woodlands, in the riparian areas, in wet areas. It is everywhere. And we want to try to make it the best possible wherever we can. I really appreciate this image. It's sort of this illustration that gets my planning juices going, to think about, a lot of farms already have habitat that isn't really recognized as habitat. A lot of people think about pollinator habitat as some kind of wildflower meadow or prairie, but in reality, they are using all these different spaces, not just pollinators, but again, we're thinking about all those different beneficial insects as well. So I know this is kind of an idealized illustration, but it does help visualize where some of these spaces could be. It could be cover crops. It could be, just your garden patches, rock piles and brush piles, those places that are important for nesting sites as well. So doing an inventory first on the site that you're working and conserving the spaces that already exist is probably one of the best things you can do to protect pollinators and their habitat. Xerces has a few tools to help you assess this habitat, to do that initial inventory and quantify it. This is one of our assessment guides where it walks through a couple different sections outlining different landscape features that would be valuable, farmscape, foraging habitat, native bee nesting habitat, and so forth. Remember how Emily was talking about how monarchs have different habitat needs than native bees, than some beneficial insects. So we have habitat assessment guides for a variety of different settings and a variety of different organisms that we may be trying to protect. So the assessment values are going to differ depending on kind of what you're trying to create here. These are all on our website. Hopefully somebody's throwing them in the chat. I can't multitask like that. But I also wanted to step back for a second because there are some folks in this audience who are either conservation planners themselves or they work with farmers kind of assisting in this way. And, I think it can be really exciting to plan habitat that's really showy and beautiful. But sometimes it's a little cart before the horse. We need to think about really what are the objectives on the site. Think about some of the reasons that people are motivated to go into a program like the Conservation Reserve Program. Usually it's because the soil is poor on that cropland, and they'd rather have it in habitat or something like that because it's not producing very good yields. Maybe there's erosion on the site. Maybe there are nutrients and pesticides moving off that site into the water. Maybe the plants aren't performing very well on a certain part of cropland because there's too much shade or because the soils are really shallow or rocky. What are all the different goals? Maybe there's a lack of food or shelter or habitat for pollinators, and that can be just because you care about pollinators. Maybe you or the landowner you're working with has honeybees. Maybe they're really concerned about providing beneficial insects for their operation. Sometimes pollinator habitat can kind of tick off all these other goals, but sometimes they should really be separated. So, what are the potential solutions for some of those conservation goals or those resource concerns? It might be terraces, it might be cover crops, it could be grass waterways, it could be prescribed grazing, it could be some combination of these things. Or, a popular one is conservation cover, or in some states call this wildlife habitat plantings. This is a little bit of NRCS jargon here, but this conservation cover, or native habitat, usually prairie species, can be in large block form, it can be in strips, it could be 0.5 acres, it could be 20 acres. I'm going to go over a little bit of the details of what that would look like in the strips program, because this is a largely Iowa audience, and I know the strips program is really, popular, and a lot of people are talking about it in terms of how to marry pollinator habitat on farmland. The strips research that came out of Iowa State has since been adopted into the CRP program, the Conservation Reserve Program. It's a farm bill program that takes land out of crop production and actually pays farmers to put in habitat or a native cover. The primary purpose of this particular practice, the CRP CP 43, Conservation Practice 43, the primary purpose is to reduce the soil erosion and to protect water quality. And Iowa State research really, indicates how well these strips accomplish those goals. The secondary purpose is to provide wildlife and beneficial insect habitat. So I have this illustration here of some grasses that we sometimes see in conservation plantings, not just grasses, but forbs too. You'll notice that these non-native grasses that we sometimes use really don't have a very robust root system. Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome, they do cover the soil and they are perennial, but they're really not doing that same kind of workhorse function that some of the native grasses are. Like you can see here, these native prairie grasses really are good at intercepting water and nutrients from above ground and below ground because of these deep fibrous root systems. So if you were to enroll in the CP43 Prairie Strips program, there are a couple different ways you could take it. And so this is kind of the strategic ways of planning habitat that can making sure you're reducing and mitigating kind of pesticide risks, but also accomplishing your other conservation goals. So you could approach this prairie strips practice and use mostly native grasses, or you could even put in like a temporal kind of buffer, like Emily was saying. Maybe your pesticide spraying happens earlier in the year. You still want to provide some forage for bees, so you plant flowers like New England aster or something that's really late blooming, that's unlikely to have some of those same pesticide risks on it much later in this growing season. Or you can have it a really dense native pollinator habitat. There's clearly a lot of, like on the bottom there, there's clearly a lot of nectar and forage resources there. But if you remember from that previous drawing, a lot of those root systems are really different. So above ground, it's having all these functions for pollinators, but it may not be as good as accomplishing some of those other conservation goals below ground. Let's see, trying to advance. Oops, go back one. Let's see here. All right. I could go through a bunch of different opportunities for creating pollinator habitat on farms. These are really fun images and things to talk through, but instead I really want to highlight some case studies. But I did just want to kind of pull it all together. There's lots of ways to support pollinators throughout the landscape. You can have habitat in forest land, in field margins. I worked with this farmer. You can see the picture of the logs up on the top. He had created it was almost like a hedgerow of native nesting blocks They're just kind of different kinds of trees. And when I walked through that site with him, we found all kinds of bees just like poking their head out of that, all of those different logs. These can be, urban scale, rural. You could leave some crops to bolt, cover crops. There's a lot of ways that pollinator habitat can integrate with grazing animals. I'm just trying to get your kind of imaginations growing here. All right, so now I want to talk about some of these case studies. The Kimber Contours Farm is sort of they're kind of close to my heart. They are one of the first farmers I started working with when I started with the Xerces Society back in 2017. They're also just exceptional farmers, thoughtful people. It's run by this group of siblings, Kurt Kimber on the left, and Chris Kimber on the far right. They're kind of the main operators of the operation. It's 240 acres just south of the Twin Cities in Dakota County. It's an organic farm. Kurt is a sort of self-described serial activist. He's very concerned about social justice, about mitigating the effects of climate change, providing food for his community. He's an inspirational farmer. They grow a variety of different crops on the farm, all for food, for human consumption: soybeans, wheat, small grains, a lot of rotations. They're also growing kernza, which is basically a perennial wheatgrass, sort of an experimental crop. And I started planting with them in 2017 as they were transitioning to organic production. And then in 2019, we ended up planting 19 acres of prairie strips. And this is before the CRP program became an option. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that, how we accomplished that in a second. So like I said, we started, you want to identify what really is there before you kind of like haphazardly throw in habitat plantings wherever there's an opportunity. Instead, we did detailed inventory of what was on site and what their goals were. So this is an organic farm, so there was a lot of soil erosion due to frequent tillage and of organic weed management. There were some really heavy rain events, and that was really creating a lot of soil erosion. And Kurt was also really concerned about creating habitat to attract those beneficial insects for pest control, because he doesn't have the same tools that a conventional farmer would for pest control. So this is kind of this is just a screenshot of some of the planning that we did together early on. And then in 2019, a couple of years later, this is the result of that early planning. We put in the kernza, and I can't take any credit for that. That was his doing. But we worked with NRCS and the Soil and Water Conservation District in the county to plan out these contour buffer strips that basically planted as prairie strips with highly diverse 37 different species in those strips. And we planted it in November of 2019, so it's a dormant planting. And already in 2021, so the second growing season, you could see the major changes on the landscape. This is June 2021. The next image, here's the local Soil and Water Conservation District took out a drone. This is 1 month later. You can see how that's just the landscape transformation. In 2021 as well, so in June 2021, the Kimbers were recognized, and they held a interagency pollinator conservation kind of event at their farm for Pollinator Week, where it brought out our Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. It brought out the Ag Commissioner Tom Peterson, and a variety of other agency leads in Minnesota. Peggy Flanagan said, "The Kimbers' work is so important in protecting our state's bees, habitats, and other pollinators. We care for our pollinators because they care for us." So the Kimbers are really being lifted up for all the work they're doing. In 2022, so just this past summer, we held another field day there, sort of a marriage of a prairie strips field day as well as a kernza field day. And on this particular plot, they had interseeded alfalfa into their kernza. And at the time of the field day, you can see our tents back there. There were just like, the whole farm was alive. There were butterflies and bees everywhere. The swallows were out like chasing all those pollinators. It was really quite a sight to behold. And Kurt closed the field day saying, "We live in a paradise. Let's just hope we can hold on to it." One final slide of the Kimbers, because they just inspire me so much, and the imagery really is striking. I went out to visit at the end of the season, September 22, and found that, just like I had kind of prefaced earlier on, it's not just that the prairie strip is the one sole solution, they're combining the solutions. I went out to find this really crazy cocktail of a cover crop mix upslope from their prairie strip. So they're bringing in all the tools, really trying to meet all of their conservation objectives. I'll give you a couple other case studies, not as in detail as the Kimbers, to spare you the time. But one other that I like to highlight is Tim Behrens. He is also recognized as an outstanding farmer conservationist. And his farm is right on the St. Croix River between Minnesota and Wisconsin. And it's in a conventional farm. He runs 160 acres. He's been no-till farming for about a couple decades. And he's been cover cropping for over 10 years. He grows his own cover crops to use on some of his acres. He's been enrolled in a lot of different Farm Bill programs, including the Conservation Stewardship Program. And in his most recent CSP, Conservation Stewardship Program contract, he put in some pollinator enhancements. And you can see that kind of in the blue polygons there. And within CSP, you really do protect the pollinator habitat from pesticides. And so this is just a quote from him. "When I signed up for pollinator habitat under the CSP program, I learned that the habitat had to be protected from neonic treated seed crops by 100 feet. Putting in a buffer, like one of those physical buffers, was not possible for me. So I agreed to not plant treated seeds in the field adjacent to the habitat." And he said, "I saw no noticeable difference in yields in those 100 feet. Now, I think that's pretty striking. Maybe makes me think about planting a lot more acres to untreated seeds. This is another farm that I visited in Winona County. I just thought it was a great example of one way to protect pollinator habitat from pesticide drift, which is to put a untreated alfalfa hay adjacent to that pollinator habitat, just creating that spatial buffer there. Another way to protect your habitat, and now this doesn't really look like habitat because it's all senesced, it's a bunch of yarrow and other flowers. The picture was taken in September, but you can see that there's a strip of flowering habitat. On the far right, kind of off in the distance, is a blueberry field, and then the non-flowering tree planting. Aaron Wills, who runs a blueberry farm in Northfield, he says, "I planted a double row of conifers to protect my pollinator habitat and organic blueberry bushes from potential pesticide drift from adjacent cropland. There wasn't a lot of room to work with, and the trees seemed like a better option than having just grass." So clearly, after a few years, this is really creating a good screen for that pesticide drift. Another quote from a farmer up in Isanti, Minnesota, from Dave Midbecky. "When planning for my new CRP planting this spring, I decided to use two different seed mixes. One composed mostly of grasses for the 10 acres adjacent to conventional row crop, and another composed of native wildflowers for the 27 acres that are more protected from pesticide exposure. I used to keep bees, and I really want my habitat to support pollinators, not just look pretty." That is really key, that we're designing habitat that has high quality and it's really actually doing what we want it to do, and not just, being sort of aesthetic value to us. So all of those quotes are on the back of this fact sheet that we created, Xerces, I should say my coworker Sarah Foltz-Jordan primarily, with our state Board of Water and Soil Resources. It's available free online, and especially if you're a conservation planner, I really like this one-page fact sheet front and back because it offers kind of simple guiding principles. That image is on the back of the sheet as well as those farmer quotes. It can be a little less intimidating to hand over to a farmer and see what other farmers have been doing. And so it's not just you, the conservation planner, kind of saying what you think you should do. It's farmers speaking to farmers. It would be remiss of me if I did not also throw in an acknowledgement that last year, PFI's Farminar series hosted a farm partner of ours, Paul Muggy, from Iowa. And he and Tim Youngquist from Iowa State co-hosted this Farminar. Paul Muggy is just a wealth of kind of wisdom about prairie strips because he's been doing this for decades, long before kind of Iowa State even really engaged in this research. So he has a lot of lessons learned through trial and error, and it's definitely worth your time to go explore that Farminar. I'll just leave you with some acknowledgement that the Xerces website has this publication library that is vast. And we have all kinds of resources, all free downloadable PDFs that can be distributed for your own kind of learning, but also to hand out to landowners that you're working with. There's some on pesticides. These are a variety of different, there's so many more on the website, but some of my favorites that talk about how to support beneficial insects. The Farming with Soil Life guide is a relatively new one. The beetle banks for beneficial insects was largely a project of Sarah Nizzi's. So go check that one out. That one's brand new too. So many good resources. Lots of pollinator resources as well. Particularly, things like nesting and overwintering habitat. There are brochures, there's plant lists. Go check it all out. I should acknowledge all the amazing partners and members that support our work. I'll also say, I believe this is a photo from a field day that PFI did. I think Sarah Nizzi was there as well. This is at Paul Muggy's farm, talking about some of those prairie strips. And I will leave our contact information here in case you want to reach out with additional questions. But this might be a good time for Emily and I to field some of the questions that have been trickling in. I know we've gone a little over that 60-minute mark, but hoping we still have some time to talk.
Yeah, thank you, Karin and Emily, for that. Wow, that was a lot and really good information in there.
And we cut out like 30 slides.
I was sitting here taking notes going, I could write a whole, small thesis just on this. All right. So yeah, we have about 15, maybe 20 minutes for questions. So if you do have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat below. I did get a couple that came in during the presentation. Well, first one was an announcement. I don't know if everyone saw in the chat, but you mentioned Sarah Nizzi a few times, Karin. Who is your counterpart in Xerces here, is doing a program for a Wild Ones chapter next month. And someone was kind enough to post that in the link. Sorry, the chat. They posted the link in the chat. That's further towards the top if anyone is interested in doing that or seeing what that's about. Sorry, I forgot my water bottle. All right. There was a question for Emily during your presentation. The question was, what insects consume soybean aphids? Could natural beneficial predator insects be used in soy fields to control aphids? And I can read that again if you need me to.
No, that's a great question. There's a pretty diverse community of beneficial insects that consume soybean aphids, things like lady beetles and lacewings and predatory wasps and flies. but it depends on the field and the pest pressure as to whether they actually effectively keep it under control. So there is, part of the reason why we emphasize things like scouting and monitoring and using economic thresholds is to protect that biological control community as well, so that you're not using broad spectrum insecticides on an annual basis, because that's also going to take out, along with your aphids, it's going to take out your beneficial insects and reduce the likelihood that those are going to be able to provide adequate control from year to year. So there's some great scouting guides. I'm sure Iowa State has a great scouting guide for beneficials as well as for soybean aphids. And that can tell you, based on the number of aphids that you have per plant, whether it is worthwhile applying an insecticide, knowing that that's going to have an impact on biological control as well. My understanding is there's not good uses of, augmentative biological control, where you're releasing biological control agents. Oftentimes they're dispersing away from the place that you are releasing them. I think that your, conservation biological control, emphasizing the community of beneficial insects that are present on an annual basis on the field is going to be a better longer term solution. Especially those sort of early season natural enemies that keep that aphid outbreaks from reaching, crop damaging levels. So yes, there's a great community of beneficial insects. Scouting and monitoring and economic thresholds are the friends in terms of how to manage that crop more effectively.
Can I just add one little anecdote to follow up on that? So I was at a meeting several years ago with a bunch of organic row crop farmers, and a researcher, a soybean aphid researcher, was talking to the crowd, and sort of halfway through his research presentation, some of the farmers, one of them stood up and was like, "Can I just take a poll? Do any of you organic farmers actually have problems with soybean aphids?" And across the room, all of them were like, "No, we don't have that problem." And they attributed it to weeds in their crop fields that were hosting a whole bunch of beneficial insects. So, totally anecdotal, but I just wanted to say that when diversity, even if it's weedy diversity, you can accidentally bring in a bunch of beneficial insects.
Thanks, Karin.
Yeah, that's good to know. Okay, I'm not sure who best to direct this one to. There was a mention of brome, I believe, in part of Emily's presentation. And this person is observing that non-native brome appears to be everywhere. But is it still being promoted and used as heavily as before, or are the agricultural community, county and state governments making a meaningful change to use native grasses instead, or like trying to proactively replace that brome?
Karin, I'm going to throw that one to you, I think.
Yeah, smooth brome is absolutely a problem in prairies. It's kind of ubiquitous in our environments. It's also really easy to manage for certain spaces. It's still being used, I think, in grass waterways, where, because it's rhizomatous, which means it has lateral roots that kind of, like a lawn grass, versus a lot of our native bunch grasses, which kind of leave gaps between the bunches, which can still create some spaces for erosion, I guess. In any case, they're still using smooth brome in some conservation practices. Largely, I think people are trying to shift to using native species in a lot of different contexts where we formerly weren't using them. There's a lot of avenues I could go down with this. I might just leave it at that for now.
Okay. Yeah, that's probably a pretty in-depth question if you kind of go down all the different avenues of that. So can nearby pollinator prairies increase crop yields? I know that both of you had kind of mentioned some research done in the opposite direction. So I'm assuming this is asking, what about crop yields next to the pollinator prairies?
I'm gonna give
Yeah.
that one to you, Emily. That's your research.
Yeah, that's definitely. It sort of depends on how pollinator dependent that neighboring crop is. So something like blueberry responds really positively to having pollinator habitat nearby. I did my grad research at Michigan State. We were looking at putting pollinator habitat close to blueberry fields and what that did for crop yields. And they actually found that the investment in the wildflower habitat paid off within 5 years in terms of the growth in crop yields from increasing pollinator visits to the crop, especially on sort of the closer edge of the field to the pollinator habitat. That's also true for soybean. My understanding is that some yield metrics in soybean actually have responded positively to having pollinator habitat nearby. You get heavier seed set, larger soybeans from having pollinators nearby. There was some research in Iowa State that found something between 30 and 50 bee species in soybean fields during soybean bloom. So there are quite a few things that are visiting soybeans as they're blooming. But yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Okay.
And also just to expand, I mean, a lot of our crops are visited by a lot of different bees, honeybees and our native bees, that they pollinate in different ways or different times of day. They might pollinate different parts of the structure of the plant. That's really true with like apples. So you can really boost your yield if you are attracting 100 different species of pollinators versus, just honeybees.
Mm-hmm. All right. I do have one last question. So if you do have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat while we're working on this one. Are there any federal grant opportunities to add pollinator area to farms? And I do know that there are some, but I'm not sure the exact names of them. So if either one of you knows that, that would be wonderful.
Karin, I think that's better suited for you too.
Yeah, and I just popped a link into the chat that's below that question. It says 2014 Farm Bill programs, but as far as I can tell, all the information in there is still is just as relevant now as it was, then. It's a really nice guide for laying out kind of all the different opportunities, who's eligible for different opportunities, what the practices might look like, how you could, use them to meet certain goals like providing more nesting habitat or providing more foraging habitat. Honestly, it's a resource that I spent hours and hours with when I first started in this position, because it helped me understand the language of federal programs, helped me think about all the different jargon and codes that they use. And it helped me just even work with different conservation planners. Yeah, I would start there. That's really the best resource I can point you to. There are also local resources that are kind of similar. A lot of conservation districts, county conservation districts have parallel funding or like bank pools of funding that are similar or that are offered from the state but funneled through county conservation districts. So it's worth checking in with both offices, your local federal office, the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, but also your local conservation district.
Okay. And I see that Emily has just put in a link to various NRCS programs in the chat.
Yeah, thanks. A webinar that our colleague Kelly Gill held on NRCS programs for pollinator conservation. So if you like the webinar format, that one's a good one.
That also brings up something that I didn't even highlight in the webinar, which is that we have really built out our YouTube channel. So a lot of our staff have been doing webinars, just like everybody else in the last few years. And so there's a lot of topics there that you can go explore.
Okay, great. So I'll just give a first name here. Jackie comments that she has been organic for 20 years, but has severe Johnson grass issues. So she must spray before any future plantings. Have timber CRP buffers. So I guess she has those buffers. Would spraying 1/3 at a time help? I'm trying to maybe get some clarification on that one.
I'm going to read.
Yeah, it's in the chat.
That a little bit.
yeah, I was trying to figure out how to.
So to have a Johnson grass issue, before you construct the habitat, using some herbicide as site prep, there's always some drawbacks to any kind of site prep. But, even if you're organic, that may be worthwhile to take that land out of production, use some herbicide to do adequate site prep, so that you can kind of expedite your high quality habitat. If you have habitat existing and you still have a Johnson grass issue and you're trying to eliminate it, then I think it might be wise, depending on the scale of the problem and how degraded it is. I think I see what you're saying about maybe just doing small portions at a time so that you're still potentially leaving refuge. That's a general best management practice that we recommend for other kinds of like patch burn granite. Yeah, like Jackie's already chiming in. Patch burning or patch mowing or patch haying, so that you're not disturbing the entire habitat all at once. It is kind of a question about how degraded it is and how much it's impacting, the benefit, the conservation value of that planting. So it might be worth bringing a planner out, inviting Sarah out to come evaluate what the conditions are and whether or not you might want to be more aggressive, or if that patch approach really is the best approach.
Yeah, I think that I'll just add to that thinking about on the front end of site prep, unless you have reason to believe that the existing habitat is really high quality or is serving as some kind of refuge for plants and animals, I'm thinking that the patch approach might backfire for weed management with Johnson grass just because of the high seed production and like rhizomatous growth that it can produce. So you might treat 1/3 of it and then have rhizomes and seeds coming in from your bank of Johnson grass that's right next door. So it might be more successful to treat the whole area at once if you're trying to put in long-term habitat and really manage the problem ahead of time. But again, yeah, good idea to get someone out there and have a better look at the planting ahead of time.
All right. Thank you. I think we have time for just one more. You have a book recommendation, Jackie, by the way, from one of our other attendees. So you might want to look into that. Even I'm going to write that down because of the title. It's called When Weeds Talk, which sounds interesting. So if anyone has an additional question, go ahead and type it in. And I'll give about a minute. All right, for those wanting to sign off, as soon as you do sign off, you will be redirected to a short evaluation on PFR's Farminar today. We would greatly appreciate any feedback you have, any comments, just to help us continue to make this Farminar series a great thing every year that we have. And again, if you do have one additional question, you can type it in. And if not, thank you for attending.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah.
Sorry that I ran so far over.
Oh no, it was a lot of really good information. Still have several people on, so I'm waiting to see if a question pops up. Great. I am going to go ahead and thank you all for attending, and I'm going to end the Farminar.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.